And Senator Whitehouse is
witness
recognized.
should give a straight answer to the question.
You can see this entire hearing on C-SPAN 3 at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going live to the House. Members taking votes on measures debated earlier today. The House voting now on approving the journal, which is the record of the previous day's proceedings. During this vote, we'll hear about what's happening in the negotiations on extending the payroll tax cut, which expires on February 29th. We spoke with a reporter who's been covering the negotiations. Jim Rowley, Congress reporter for Bloomberg News. House and Senate negotiators may have reached an agreement on the payroll tax issue. What are you hearing?
We are hearing that they're close to an agreement. We're told by Fred Upton, the Michigan Republican who chairs the Energy and Commerce Committee, that the House Republican and maybe the Democratic Republican Senate negotiators are going to meet to review the bidding at 5. And Harry Reid suggested at his news conference that they were close because he said he was quite hopeful and optimistic that something could be worked out.
So what about the unemployment insurance and scheduled cuts to payments to doctors who treat Medicare payments? Is there talk about those two things as well?
There is talk about including those provisions as well. And Harry Reid said today that he hoped that some of the tax expenditures, such as the business expensing issues, could also be included. It's unclear whether those are in the scope of the agreement.
How would those two items, unemployment insurance and the Medicare doc fix, be paid for?
Well, that's what they've been haggling about. I mean, the Republicans are suggesting that, or insisting that they be paid for with spending offsets. And Reid himself said today that we may have to pay for those. So he's also seems to be acknowledging that may be the outcome, particularly since the House has now conceded that they will not be insisting upon similar budget offsets to pay for the payroll tax cut, which is the biggest item, which is $94 billion for the next 10 months, according to the Obama administration's latest budget.
Why would negotiators decide to approve a longer-term payroll tax cut bill without being paid for?
Well, I think the Republicans are anxious to get this issue behind them, as they understand that they suffered some political knocks back in December, and as Steny Hoyer, the Democratic whip, said today, they remember December, and they want to avoid being accused of mishandling this again. And I think they understand the public really wants this to happen. The president is harping on the fact that this is an important thing that would interfere with economic recovery, and while Republicans may not agree that this is something that's necessary for the economic recovery, I think there's a political perception that they don't want to cross at this point.
How quickly might the House act on this?
Well, I think that if there's a conference report, I think they could probably wrap it up in a couple of days. It's now Tuesday. They could probably presumably if there's language, they could probably get this done by Friday. And if there's some delay in drafting, maybe they'd have to come in on Saturday. I don't know.
What about the Senate? What are you hearing from lawmakers in that chamber?
Well, there is some concern among some of the new Republicans, like Pat Toomey and Rand Paul, that they don't like the idea of not paying for the payroll tax. And in fact, Ben Cardin voiced some concern too. There are liberal Democrats who balked at this idea when the payroll tax holiday was first enacted, that this would deplete money from the Social Security Trust Fund. So you have sort of an interesting alliance between liberals and conservatives on this question.
Jim Rowley is Congress reporter for Bloomberg News. Appreciate your time.
Glad to do it.
Here's how Congressional Quarterly is writing about the status of the payroll tax cut talks. Under the emerging agreement, a 10-month extension of the payroll tax cut would be allowed to add to the federal budget deficit. The cost of the rest of the bill would likely be offset by auctioning off a portion of electromagnetic spectrum used by television broadcasters and by reducing spending on mandatory programs, including aspects of the 2010 health care law. And The Hill reports that aides say the remaining key issues facing lead conferees are whether to include expiring tax extender provisions. They were also working on the final details on the offsets for the nearly $60 billion required to pay for jobless benefits and the Medicare Doc Fix, which fills the gaps for doctors treating Medicare patients. Earlier today, President Obama spoke about the need to pass the payroll tax cut package.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Everybody, please have a seat. Well, good morning, and let me start with a quick public service announcement for all the gentlemen out there. Today is Valentine's Day. Do not forget. I speak from experience here. It is important that you remember this and go big. That's my advice. Lately I've been saying that this is a make or break moment for the middle class in America and for folks who want to be in the middle class. We face a choice. We can settle for a country where a few people do really, really well and everybody else struggles just to get by. Or we can restore an economy where everybody gets a fair shot and everybody's doing their fair share and everybody's playing by the same set of rules. And that second option is, I strongly believe, the kind of America that we want for our kids and our grandkids. That's who we are. That's the America that we believe in. That's what we have to roll up our sleeves and get back to doing, is creating an America where everybody's doing their fair share, everybody gets a fair shot, everybody's engaging in fair play. Now, we're still fighting our way back from the worst economic crisis in our lifetimes, and we've still got a lot of work to do and a long way to go. It's going to take time to recover all the jobs that were lost when the recession was at its depths. But the fight is beginning to turn our way. Over the past 2 years, our businesses have added over 3.7 million new jobs. Our manufacturers are hiring more new workers to make more new things here in America than at any time since the 1990s. So our economy is growing stronger. And the last thing we need, the last thing we can afford to do, is to go back to the same policies that got us in this mess in the first place. The last thing we need is for Washington to stand in the way of America's comeback. Now, first and foremost, that means Washington shouldn't hike taxes on working Americans right now. That's the wrong thing to do. But that's exactly what's going to happen at the end of this month, in a couple of weeks, if Congress doesn't do something about it. The payroll tax cut we put in place last year will expire. The typical American family will shell out nearly $1,000 more in taxes this year. You'll lose about $40 out of every paycheck if Congress does not act. And that can't happen. Not now. And it doesn't have to. Congress needs to extend that tax cut along with vital insurance lifelines for folks who've lost their jobs during this recession. And they need to do it now, without drama and without delay. No ideological sideshows to gum up the works. No self-inflicted wounds. Just pass this middle-class tax cut, pass the extension of unemployment insurance, do it before it's too late, and I will sign it right away. Now, the good news is, over the last couple of days, we've seen some hopeful signs in Congress that they realize that they've got to get this done. And you're starting to hear voices talk about how can we go ahead and make this happen in a timely way on behalf of the American people. That is good news. But as you guys know, you can't take anything for granted here in Washington until my signature is actually on it. So we've got to keep on making sure that the American people's voices keep breaking through until this is absolutely, finally, completely done. Until you see me sign this thing, you've got to keep on speaking up. Until you see that photograph of me signing it at my desk, make sure it's verified, certified. If it's not on the White House website, it hasn't happened. And I'm going to need to make sure that your voices are heard. Last December when we had this same fight, your voices made all the difference. We asked folks to tell what it was like, what it would be like if they lost $40 out of every one of their paychecks. Because we wanted to make sure that people understood this is not just an abstract argument. This is concrete. This makes a difference in the lives of folks all across the country in very important ways. Tens of thousands of working Americans flooded us with their stories. And some of them are here with me today. And their feedback's been pretty unanimous. Allowing this tax cut to expire would make people's lives harder right now. It would make their choices more difficult. It would be $40 less for groceries to feed your kids. It would be $40 less for the medications you depend on. $40 less to cover bills and the rent. $40 less to take care of an elder parent or to donate to a church or a charity. And when gas prices are on the rise again, because as the economy strengthens, global demand for oil increases, and if we start seeing significant increases in gas prices, losing that $40 could not come at a worse time. One local entrepreneur named Thierry, where's Thierry? He's right here. He told us that $40 would cover the gas that gets him to his day job, or alternatively, the internet service that his small business depends on. So he'd have to start making a choice. Do I fill up my gas tank to get to my work, or do I give up my entrepreneurial dream? $40, he wrote, means a heck of a lot. Means a heck of a lot. And that's what this debate is all about. This is what's at stake for millions of Americans. This is why it matters to people. It matters a heck of a lot. And I'm asking the American people to keep their stories coming. Tell us what $40 means to you. If you tweet it, use the hashtag $40. Call, tweet, write your congressman, write your senators. Tell them, do not let up until this thing gets done. Don't let taxes go up on 160 million working Americans. Don't let millions of Americans who are out there looking for work right now, and the economy is starting to improve, but they don't have a job yet. Don't leave them without a lifeline in terms of cutting off their unemployment insurance. When a plane is finally lifting off the ground, you don't ease up on the throttle. You keep the throttle on full. You keep going. And our plane is up there, but we're not at cruising altitude yet. After all, extending this tax cut and the unemployment insurance is the least of what we should be doing for working Americans. It's just a start. We need to rebuild an economy where middle-class folks can focus on more than just getting by. And folks who want to get in the middle class have those ladders to get into the middle class. We've got to rebuild an economy where the middle class thrives and more Americans have a chance to earn their way into it. An economy built to last. Yesterday I released a blueprint for how we get there. It's a blueprint for an economy built on new American manufacturing and new American energy sources and new skills and education for American workers and a new focus on the values that are the bedrock of this country. Values like fairness and responsibility for all and from all. We're going to be better off if we start building that economy right now. And we can do it because we've done it before. We have a common challenge. It's time for us to meet it with a common purpose and to show a sense of seriousness that's equal to the task. So on behalf of all the hard-working Americans who are standing behind me, I want to thank you for helping to tell your story and tell the story of why this is so important. And I just want everybody all across the country to keep the pressure up so that we get this done. It is going to make our economy stronger, and it's going to put us in a position where we can start really rebuilding on behalf of not just this generation, but future generations. Thank you very much, everybody. God bless. God bless America.
We'll continue to watch for developments in the payroll tax cut negotiations. In the meantime, there were a number of events with Chinese President Xi Jinping today, who's here for his first official visit to the U.S. He met with President Obama and Vice President Biden. He spoke at a lunch at the State Department and later at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the Congressional Executive China Commission held a hearing on human rights abuses in China. At the hearing, Representative Frank Wolf admonished President Obama for not meeting with the wives of imprisoned Chinese dissidents testifying before the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I think this administration has been a total failure, and quite frankly, I think all the groups around this country should know this and not pretend it is not true. The Coptic Christians in Egypt should know this administration has failed them. The Iraqi and Syrian Chaldean Christians should know this administration has failed them. The Vietnamese in Vietnam, both Buddhists and Catholic, ought to know this administration has failed them. And of course, the Catholic bishops in China and the Protestant house church leaders in China should know that this administration has failed them. And the Dalai Lama ought to know that this administration has failed them. 11 now Buddhist monks and nuns have set themselves aflame. But I want to bring it back to this. And I did not know that you had made a request. I would like to ask both of the wives if they would say publicly, I see the media here looking, and what would you say? Because there's still an opportunity to meet after the Vice President from China leaves. What would you say if you had an opportunity to meet with President Obama? And shame on them both if they do not meet. Shame on them both if they do not meet. You know that President Reagan would have met with you. You know President Clinton would have met with you. You know President Bush would have met with you. You know President Jimmy Carter would have met with you. So shame on them if they do, but maybe they won't. So this may be the only opportunity. What would both of the wives want to say if they were talking to President Obama and Vice President Bush?
我就说我先生是个好人，他一直都在做好事，他一直都在用行公益啊，必须释放他，必须让他自由。高深的所作，在文明社会都认可的价值，为什么在中共是遭受这种打压和迫害？
If I if I have opportunity to meet President Obama and Vice President Biden, I would tell him my husband Gao Zhishen is a good people, and he always do good deeds. And what he have done in China is actually apply with the world standard, international standards. So why in China he has to be persecuted? Why he had to be suffering from all kinds of tortures? Please help release him immediately.
As this vote continues, one more update on the payroll tax cut negotiations. The Associated Press writes that House Senate talks on renewing President Obama's signature payroll tax cut made significant progress today, as aides said an agreement could be reached later in the day. There are, a Democratic aide said, quote, a couple of lingering issues, but we're getting closer and closer. The negotiations intensified after House GOP leaders dropped a demand that the $100 billion or so cost of renewing the 2 percentage point cut in the Social Security payroll tax be defrayed with spending cuts elsewhere in the budget. Later this week, the House is expected to debate the Surface Transportation Bill. Congressional Quarterly writes that House Republicans are splitting the measure into three pieces by spinning off two provisions. One on forcing federal employees to pay more for their retirement plans to help pay for the transportation legislation, and another that would open up domestic oil and gas drilling. Both of those measures would be voted on separately from the main bill. And an article in The Hill has a headline, CBO report finds House GOP highway bill would bankrupt trust fund. Republicans are pushing back against a new report from the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO report finds that the cost of the $260 billion bill would not be offset by the gas tax paid by motorists and increased revenue in the bill that would expand domestic oil and gas drilling. It predicts the Highway Trust Fund would be $78 billion short after 10 years under the highway bill. Again, that transportation bill is expected here in the House this week. The Senate is also working on its version of the highway bill this week. The Associated Press is reporting that GOP lawmakers are saying that House and Senate negotiators have reached a tentative pact on payroll tax cut extension. Congressional Quarterly wrote earlier that under the emerging agreement, a 10-month extension of the payroll tax cut would be allowed to add to the federal budget deficit, and the cost of the rest of the bill would likely be offset by auctioning off a portion of electromagnetic spectrum used by television broadcasters and by reducing spending on mandatory programs, including aspects of the 2010 health care law. Again, the Associated Press is reporting that House and Senate negotiators have reached a tentative pact on the payroll tax cut extension. As this vote on the previous day's proceedings winds down, an update from the Associated Press on the payroll tax cut talks. House and Senate negotiators have reached a tentative agreement on renewing a payroll tax cut that delivers about $20 a week to the average worker. They hope to send the legislation to President Obama as early as this week. Under the outlines of the agreement, a 2 percentage point cut in the Social Security payroll tax would be extended through the end of the year. Jobless benefits for the long-term unemployed would be renewed as well, and doctors would be saved from a cut in their Medicare payments. The headline in the National Journal: tentative payroll tax cut deal is reached. Plan still needs to be finalized, but support seems solid. Congress has reached a tentative agreement to extend an employee payroll tax holiday, as well as federal unemployment benefits and a Medicare pay fix, according to senior House and Senate aides. A senior House aide familiar with the talks said that House lawmakers who met today have tentatively okayed the deal. Under the plan, a 10-month extension of a payroll tax holiday will not be paid for. The deal will result in a conference committee report that both chambers are expected to pass this week.
On this vote, the yeas are 303, the nays are 89, with one member voting present. The journal stands approved. House will come to order. Members will kindly clear the well and take their conversations outside of the chamber. The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Campbell of California for today and Wednesday, February the 15th. Mr. Culberson of Texas for today. Mr. Davis of Illinois for today. And Mr. Heinrich of New Mexico for today.
Without objection, requests are granted.
Your replacement. Oh. Okay. I don't see him at this time.
The chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. What purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition? Without objection. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak about a very happy occasion for every member of the Arizona delegation. I'm proud to have introduced HCON Res 100, which invites the entire House of Representatives to join with the Arizona delegation in commemorating Arizona's centennial. For the past 100 years, Arizona has stood as a beacon of opportunity for millions of individuals who came to the state to make a better life for themselves and their families. They came to Arizona and built the state we know today, a state with rich diversity, a soaring optimism, driven by an innovative spirit. They came because they know that Arizona embodies what's best in America. I can't imagine a better place to live, and I'm proud to call Arizona home. I'm proud that it's the place that I've chosen to start my family, and representing this wonderful state is an honor beyond words. Arizona has had 100 great years. We start the next 100 with the same spirit of optimism and determination that made our state great, and we still possess that same fierce independence needed to keep it great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The House will be in order. What purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as many of you know, today is Arizona's 100th birthday. And think of this. 100 years ago, there were only about 200,000 people in Arizona. Today, there's about 6.5 million. And one of the reasons I wanted to come behind the microphone today is if you've been watching our senators and some of my fellow members of our delegation, we've all gotten behind microphones and talked about the wonderful leaders, the Carl Haydens, the Morris Udalls, the Barry Goldwaters that have come from Arizona. But I actually want to say something special about the people of Arizona. Think of this. In our 100 years, 6.5 million have chosen to make it its home. And I believe it's both because of the wonderful lifestyle of Arizona, but also the people themselves. It's a unique population. Think of this. You have a state full of people who've chosen to pick up their homes in California and the Midwest and back east and venture into a new life. And actually, that type of entrepreneurial spirit, that type of unique personality, I think is actually what makes Arizona so special. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further requests for 1 minute speeches? Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege and honor to be recognized by you to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to take up some of the issues of our day. First, I'd like to address the situation that we are in with regard to the payroll tax extension and the unemployment extension and the components that are being deliberated now as the conference committee is trying to get to a final solution. And I'd take you back, Mr. Speaker, to the lame duck session a year ago last December when within 30 to 45 days of the election of this 112th Congress, the legitimized and now 112th Congress, there were the lame duck session negotiations took place, initiated by the Minority Leader of the United States Senate, Mitch McConnell, and President Obama, to deal with a way of extending the Bush tax brackets to avoid the automatic imposition of a 55% death tax at midnight on New Year's at the beginning on the first minute of 2011. And also was a payroll tax holiday, and it was also the refundable tax credits, unemployment benefits extended, and the list went on. Mr. Speaker, I'd just make the point that we had 87 freshman Republicans waiting in the wings during that lame duck session. They were the legitimate representatives of the American people. And when the United States Congress makes a decision to move forward on large pieces of legislation, any large piece of legislation in a lame duck session, then it must be something that is urgent and mandatory that we take that kind of action. Our founding fathers did not imagine that we would, well, first of all, Thomas Jefferson said large initiatives should not be advanced on slender majorities. Large initiatives should not be advanced on slender majorities, but, Mr. Speaker, also, large initiatives should not be advanced by lame duck sessions of the United States Congress. When that happens, you have a lot of people that are going home. 87 freshman Republicans, 9 freshman Democrats, they replaced all of them, people that were going home. So there's your math. 96 members of this Congress today, and there have been several others that have been added, but 96 were waiting in the wings to be sworn into office here in the first week in January so they could do their just constitutional duty. And while that was going on, the negotiations were taking place, and for a lame duck session, a large initiative lame duck session to address Bush tax bracket extensions, unemployment benefit extensions, and for the first time, the severance of the 50-50 relationship between employer and employee and the contributions to the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, I've watched that Social Security Trust Fund since I came here to this Congress, and it was at about a plus of $1.74 trillion. It's grown to $2.34 trillion, and one of the times I looked, it's moving quickly now because the higher the unemployment, the more damage it does to our Social Security Trust Fund because the contributions slow down. And as we're seeing baby boomers retire and qualify for Social Security and Medicare, there are more and more demands on the Social Security Trust Fund. But the payroll tax holiday that was passed, and that's what it was called, but it actually created a $130 billion hole in the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, you can charge it against the general fund, and when the time comes to pay the bill, it'll have to come out of the general fund because the Social Security Trust Fund is borrowed from by the federal government anyway. But the accounting created a $130 billion hole. And you can count that up proportionally. And around $10, $11 billion a month, each month that there is an extension of the suspension of the 2% contribution of the employee into the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, that was one of the components from the lame duck session. We never should have, Mr. Speaker, never should have severed the 50-50 bond between equal contribution to the Social Security Trust Fund out of the employer and the employee. As soon as that happens, it opens the door for class envy. It opens the door. It already had discriminated against the employer in benefit of the employee. Now, if it had been a reduction of 1% from the employer and 1% from the employee, at least then the 50-50 bond would have been withheld. We have in the past adjusted the Social Security contribution rate so that we have a viable fund. But we have not in the past broken that 50-50 equal contribution employer-employee. That happened in the lame duck session. It was one of those things that was agreed to in order to be able to extend the Bush tax brackets. Extending the Bush tax brackets at that time gets us just till December 31st of this year, and then the game changes again. Now, it is a way to avoid having that be a debate while President Obama is up for re-election, just like the debt ceiling was timed so that the President can essentially direct a debt ceiling increase and avoid having a fight here on the floor of the House or the Senate to approve another debt ceiling increase. It looks as though we've negotiated some agreements that keep the President off the hook for holding him accountable coming into this presidential election. But to add into that agreement, the lame duck deal, I will call it, Mr. Speaker, when you add to that agreement the payroll tax situation that suspended 2% from the employee and didn't suspend any from the employer and broke that bond. We also had the extension of the Bush tax brackets, and we had an adjustment to the death tax, which was 0 on the day that this was voted upon, but it jumped to 35%. It was automatically going to go to 55%. And we had also an extension of unemployment benefits out to 99 weeks, Mr. Speaker. 99 weeks of unemployment benefits are, as far as the charts that I have looked at and my memory, unprecedented in the history of this country. 99 weeks. So the 99 weeks of unemployment, that and the extension of refundable tax credits and a few other smaller programs totaled $212 billion in outlays just for the duration of that bill. That bill that was negotiated by people who were anxious to make a deal. And why? I have a little trouble figuring out why Republicans were anxious to make a deal, Mr. Speaker, because we had 87 new freshmen waiting in the wings. The legitimate voices of the American people, the shock troops that they sent here, they sent them here for fiscal responsibility. Every single one of them ran on the 100% repeal of Obamacare. They ran on fiscal responsibility. They ran on a balanced budget. And $212 billion went out the window with the lame duck deal without hardly any debate. $212 billion, most of it to extend unemployment benefits for 99 weeks, but some of it for refundable tax credits, and that did not include the $130 billion created by the suspension of 2% of the contribution rate into the Social Security Trust Fund, that hole that was created. All of this so the Bush tax brackets could be extended beyond the re-election of the President of the United States. That agreement, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion and a strong conviction, should never have been negotiated in a lame duck session. We should have allowed the new members of this Congress, the 87 freshman Republicans, the 9 freshman Democrats, to weigh in, to have a chance to debate, to configure a policy, and to vote. But meanwhile, they were waiting in the wings going through orientation while this vote was taking place. And by the time they were actually seated here in this Congress, that horse was out of the barn. You know, that plane had already left the runway. And the horse was out of the barn. The payroll tax was what it was. And it was set to expire at the first day of this year, as we know. Now it's been extended for 2 months, and we're in the negotiations to see what to do with the rest of it. But the problem's rooted back in a bad deal, the lame duck deal, and now this freshman class is being asked to address it, to solve the problem, and they're not necessarily reach in their pockets and pay the price, but to pay the political price to try to resolve this issue, which is going to go on and on and on until we put the pieces back together, Mr. Speaker. We've got to put the pieces back together, and to get there politically, no one can paint that picture for me. No one can draw that map. And since I couldn't draw that map either, I wouldn't have gone there in the first place. But we are where we are. It's $212 billion in outlays to extend unemployment benefits from the lame duck session a year ago last December. And it's $130 billion in the hole in the Social Security Trust Fund. You can define it some other way, but that's what it is. And the result of extending unemployment benefits out to 99 weeks was that we had a lot of workers in America that were 63 years old that amazingly found themselves unemployed, with unemployment benefits guaranteed, with no obligation on their part except sign up, out for the duration of their working career. And so it amounted to an early retirement for 63-year-old employees or 64-year-old employees in America, unmeasured in what its impact on our economy. And meanwhile, the measure of what happens when you pay people not to work for 2 years is that their skills atrophy, they're out of the workforce, technology moves on, not only they're not getting caught up with and staying caught up with technological changes and and the modern shifts within our very nimble economy that we must have, but the skills that they had on that day are atrophying. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have unemployment. We should have. It has been, the consistent duration of unemployment has been 26 weeks. That's a half a year. And if you look at the data, when unemployment runs out, people are far more likely to go to work than they are the week before it runs out. It is a fact. It is not an opinion. It's a fact, Mr. Speaker. But my point here is that we're in this discussion today with a pretty difficult decision that's being made by the conference committee, by the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and others. But this difficulty we have now is rooted in what I consider to be a mistake in the lame duck deal. And oh, Mr. Speaker, how I wonder how much different it might have been if we had waited and seated the freshman class, consulted with them, asked them if they wanted to sever that 50-50 equal contribution rate between employers and employees, asked them if they were willing to accept on their conscience a $130 billion hole in the Social Security Trust Fund, asked them if they were ready to face extending the payroll tax reduction and doing so in perpetuity as long as the other side's willing to play class envy. Are we going to be willing to continue to dig a hole in the Social Security Trust Fund? That is one question in front of us. Another one that's in front of us is, and I'd like to ask the freshman class also, did you ever really think that 99 weeks of unemployment was the appropriate thing to do? How did you intend to fund that? Would you have found it paid for if you thought 99 weeks was the appropriate way to deal with an unsettled employment situation in America? Do you have compassion for the employers that are looking to build their businesses with employees when it's difficult to hire them off of the unemployment rolls? We had a hearing before the Small Business Committee, Mr. Speaker, and then before that committee we had 4 or 5 employers, small business employers. There might actually have been 6, but I asked them going down the line, have you had any kind of luck hiring from the unemployment? And they invariably said, once the unemployment expires, I can hire them just fine. One employer out of the list said that she had hired off of the unemployment rolls on 1 occasion. That's fairly typical. I will tell you that I know of businesses in my neighborhood that look around the neighborhood and they see that there are employees that they'd like to hire. They know when their unemployment benefits run out, they'll be knocking on their door a week or 2 weeks before the unemployment benefits run out so that they're in line to hire them. We have employers that are lining up to hire the unemployed, but they know they can't get that done as long as unemployment is being paid. Now, yes, there are people that are unfortunate. There are people that can't find a job. There especially are people in parts of the economy and parts of the country that have an economy that's far worse than that I represent in northwest Iowa, Mr. Speaker. But we need a logical unemployment plan, perhaps one that ratchets those benefits in an incremental way so that it slowly provides more incentive for people to go to work. And, you know, it's not just that you as an unemployed can't find a job in the community you live in the profession that you happen to have been practicing before you were laid off. No, Mr. Speaker, there are many more aspects to this. There's such a thing as travel. Go and get a job where you can get one. Relocate there if the job's good enough. Go check it out. Call for your family if it's good enough. That's happened throughout the history of this country. And for our federal government to essentially say to people, you're not going to be obligated to relocate. Some of the people over on this side of the aisle think that somehow we ought to take the jobs to where people live. And it puts me in mind of of an article that was researched and written. I happen to have read it in the Des Moines Register some years ago, perhaps more than a decade ago, I'm certain, Mr. Speaker. They had gone into a neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and a residential neighborhood, and interviewed every household there and all the residences in a 6 blocks by 6 block area, 36 square blocks. And as they interviewed the families and did a, I guess I can't say the word, and analyzed the families and identified the characteristics of the families, they didn't find a single male employed head of household in all 36 square blocks of the residential area in Milwaukee. The history of that area was that the people in that neighborhood had predominantly been descended from those who moved up to Milwaukee right after the Prohibition ended to take on the brewery jobs, the good brewery jobs in Milwaukee. They brewed a lot of beer in Milwaukee, and they created good jobs there right at the end of the Prohibition era, and people were willing to move from the Gulf states up into those neighborhoods to go to work in the breweries. Well, now, so that would be the 30s. And from the 30s to the 90s, a 60-year period of time, so to speak. So Thomas Jefferson would call that 3 generations. I'd say probably so. 1 generation arrived in Milwaukee at the dawn of the aftermath of Prohibition. Another generation was born and raised, and the grandchildren were still living there, but they didn't have a single employed male head of household in 36 square blocks. And the story was about the lament, Mr. Speaker, that we couldn't bring jobs to the people in that neighborhood. But truthfully, their ancestors, their parents or grandparents, had moved to Milwaukee from the Gulf states for the jobs, and it didn't occur to the person writing the article that people could also move for jobs in the modern era. That is what you must do. If we're going to have a flexible, mobile economy, we've got to go to where the work is. But the disincentive is there from the federal government that discourages such things, and we don't ask very much the question about why is it that not a single male head of household is employed in this entire 6 block by 6 block area of Milwaukee. And the biggest answer to that is that the 72 different means-tested welfare programs that we have are disincentives for people to find a job. Now, that sounds shocking to the hyperventilating liberal left, Mr. Speaker, but it's just a fact. It's a fact of human nature. And so the discouragement from finding a job has created the neighborhoods of people that don't have a tradition of working anymore. And it's a very sad thing to think that America, that was built on high productivity and the efficiency we have and the intuitive nature, the instinctive, innovative nature of Americans, has been what's made our economy so strong. And here we sit with this discussion about whether unemployment should be 99 weeks or 79 weeks or 69 weeks. Mr. Speaker, 26 weeks had been long enough for almost all of the history of this country. We are not in an economic situation that matches that of the Great Depression at this point, although the debt that's been accumulated does match that of the Great Depression and then some. I recall the President coming before our Republican conference on February 10th of 2009, shortly after he'd been inaugurated as President, to make the case that we should advance his economic stimulus plan. His $787.5 billion grown into $8.25 billion, shovel-ready, spend now, pay interest, and pay principal later plan. And he said to us, FDR's New Deal actually did work. It worked, but FDR lost his nerve, and in the second, he got worried about spending too much money, and so he pulled back. And when he pulled back in the second half of the 30s, it brought about a recession within a depression. These are President Obama's words. And this recession within a depression, unemployment went up, and before then the economy could recover, along came World War II, the greatest economic stimulus plan ever. That's the President's presentation to us. He convinced me, and I think everybody that was listening that day, that President Obama will not lose the nerve that he believes FDR lost. President Obama is the lead Keynesian economist on steroids in the history of the country, and I believe the world. and that he believes that borrowing money and spending money will stimulate the economy, and as that economy rolls, that the benefits of it will create jobs. He believes that if you borrow money and hand it to people, not in exchange for a good or a service that's been produced, but just get it in their hands one way or another. If they'll work for it, fine, give them something for working. If they won't or can't, give them something because they can surely be busy spending. They've got more time to do that if they're not working after all. And spending money stimulates the economy. Mr. Speaker, Keynesian economists believe that spending money stimulates the economy. I believe this, that we here in America have to produce goods and services that have a marketable value and can be sold competitively here and abroad. We need to produce our way out of this economic doldrum that we're in, not spend our way out of it. I believe that if you spend billions of dollars, and in the President's case I have to say, give him his due, trillions of dollars, 4, 5, or more trillions of extra dollars in debt that have been piled upon us, they believe that if you spend that, that comes back to you several-fold. In fact, the statement was made by our Secretary of Agriculture that for every dollar in food stamps that gets spent, it stimulates $1.84 in economic activity. Now, if that's the case, why don't we give out a lot more food stamps? Maybe we ought to just, and that's because people have to produce the food and they have to deliver it, stock it, shelve it, those things. Well, if that's such a good economic stimulator, why don't we just do all of that and then throw the food away? We can stimulate the economy too. But who's going to pay the debt? And here's what I do believe, Mr. Speaker, and that is that if we borrow money and hand it to people and say, spend it, spend it, spend it, it's your patriotic duty, it may stimulate the economy for a short while. I call it a sugar high. And maybe just for a little while you can get that little bump, a very, very temporary. But the trade-off is that the trough that you might otherwise be falling into may not will not, but may not be as deep as it would be otherwise. But the result will be you have to recover and you have to pay off the interest and the principal. So even though you might not fall as far, you have a lot broader trough to recover from. We have to pay the interest and we have to pay the principal on all of this debt that's been accumulated over the last 3+ years. And it doesn't mean that the Bush administration is somehow forgiven for the debt that's been driven up. But during the height of the Iraq War, the Bush administration came within $160 billion of balancing the budget. $160 billion. Now that sounds like loose change today compared to the President's budget that he rolled out, which is a minus $1.33 trillion. You add up a deficit of $1.33 trillion and you increase taxes by more than $1.5 trillion in that process, you can see what happens, Mr. Speaker. This budget that the President has offered should be the news of the day. And maybe we ought to be looking at what's in it. But what we're really here instead is it's debt on arrival, that his budget will not be brought up, certainly not here in the House. At least I don't think so here in the House, unless it's to illustrate its lack of support. But last year, President Obama's budget was brought up on the floor of the Senate, and of all the talk about giving the President his due and working with the President on his budget was voted on in the Senate and voted down 97-0. 97-0. Mr. Speaker, I don't know that I've had a piece of legislation come to the floor of this Congress that had that kind of unanimous, well, I guess I can't say support, unanimous rejection. That would be tough on my ego if I couldn't get anybody to agree with me after I had all of that staff to put that big budget together. But they didn't want to be held accountable for what the President's budget said. The President now has a political document, not a fiscal management document, that he'll run around the country talking about his budget, and he will use it to beat up on Republicans that don't support his budget, and maybe he'll realize that it isn't just Republicans. It was last time, it was Harry Reid and all the Democrats that voted on the budget over in the Senate. We didn't support it over on this side either. We had a couple of budgets come to the floor here in the House of Representatives last year, Mr. Speaker, and one of them was the RSC budget that balanced in 8 to 9 years. And the other one was what we call the Ryan budget, the Republican conference budget. That's the one that actually passed here on the floor of the House. And even though that budget had a level of austerity to it, and even though it was groundbreaking in the boldness with which it addressed a path to prosperity, it wasn't strong enough, Mr. Speaker. It went in the right direction, and it was bold by historical standards, not particularly bold by the standards that we need to envision the future. And today we have the chairman of the Budget Committee, or I guess it was yesterday, make the statement that we have 2 to 3 years and we have the potential of becoming one huge Greece. I have been making a similar statement over the last year and a half or so, and this is what I believe is that, by the way, Greece is relatively easily bail out if you want to do that, because their economy is only 2% of the EU's GDP, and that's European Union's gross domestic product, just in case the acronyms are bothering people, Mr. Speaker. 2% of the EU's GDP, not that hard to fix. But here in the United States, we have a different kind of difficulty. The Ryan budget a year ago, though, didn't balance for 26 years. It left us with a national debt at the end of 10 years of $23 trillion. Walked into it with $14.3 trillion in national debt and ended up 10 years down the road with $23 trillion in national debt. But when the debt ceiling deal was made last August, it broke faith with the Ryan budget. The projected $23 trillion in national debt became $26 trillion in national debt. But in fairness, without applying the Ryan budget, we were looking at $28 trillion in national debt 10 years from now. $14.3 trillion to $28 trillion. The Ryan budget dialed the $28 trillion down to 23. The debt ceiling deal dialed it back up to $26 trillion in national debt in 10 years. It's hard to declare a victory over a $1.2 trillion cut on a debt ceiling deal if you're reducing the projected national debt from $28 trillion down to $26 trillion, and if you're dealing with a budget that no longer is binding, having broken faith with at least the big numbers within that Republican conference / Ryan budget, on a budget that didn't balance for 26 years, I have to go back and look at my 3 sons that are grown and they're in their 30s right now and say to them, sorry, we didn't have a balanced budget in the previous decade. We haven't had an effective balanced budget, I don't believe, passed in this millennia. And in 26 years, if all goes well, and we've already said it's probably not going to, we might see a balanced budget, but you will, my sons, be eligible for that Social Security that will be paid for out of the trust fund that has by then hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, in holes created in it by paying for things now that make us feel good or we avoid the political confrontation of it. And you'll never, having worked and paid taxes into the United States of America in an entire career, and know what a balanced budget is passed out of the United States Congress. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, those sons in their 30s that have been working well over a decade now, to go through an entire career and be knocking on the door of Medicare eligibility, Social Security eligibility, having watched a hole created and expanded bigger and bigger in the Social Security Trust Fund every year, while they're closer and closer to being able to finally qualify for Social Security and Medicare. And we can't fix this problem now, and the federal government is running a deficit for all of those years. 26, 28, 38, add 10, 12, 40 years. 40 years of deficits are what are staring us in the face now, before we can get to the point of paying off the first dollar on our national debt. And that's if we would stick with Ryan's budget of last year, and I'm hopeful we'll do better this year. But the President, who speaks in his State of the Union address, in front of where you're seated right now, Mr. Speaker, when he came for this much-anticipated State of the Union address a couple of weeks ago, made no mention whatsoever of a balanced budget. He didn't make a mention of fiscal responsibility, let alone austerity. He laid out his agenda of spending, and I guess I know now why he didn't address that promise that he made 3 years ago, which he said he was going to cut the deficit in half by the end of his term. Well, no, that hasn't happened. That would require a deficit proposal by his budget of roughly $500 billion, somewhere in that neighborhood. He has got red ink in his own budget of $1.33 trillion, and he says this is not the time for us to tighten our belt. This isn't the time for austerity. Well, the economy can't stand it now. Well, the creditors are not going to be able to take this much longer either. And as I sat over asking a series of questions in the German finance minister's office not that long ago, we went through the national debt of the countries that are in trouble. Those who have had their bond ratings just lowered by the news that I saw today. And if you add up the debt, the national debt of those countries, and I'll name them: Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Ireland, Belgium, those countries. If you take the national debt of those countries, not including France, for example, but just the countries that have been for months now hanging in the balance of facing the fear of default, their total cumulative national debt, if they paid off everything that they owed as a country, the sovereign debt of those countries that I have mentioned totals $4.5 trillion. Now, the President already met that, running up the debt by the first 3 years of his office. He'd already arrived at a little over $4 trillion. And so we're in the same neighborhood. The red ink spent under this administration was enough red ink to pay off the sovereign debt of the nations in the EU that are having trouble. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have done that, but look at the austerity that Greece is having to accept, and the fires in the streets when the streets of Athens go aflame when they find out that about 15,000 government jobs have been cut in order to meet the budgetary guidelines that they must meet if they're going to be able to borrow money from, who are the players in the European Union? It really comes down to Germany now today. 15,000 government jobs cut. In Greece alone, a little old country that's 2% of the GDP of the EU, and we're here, and we can't tighten our belt. We have a president that puts a budget out that will not even speak of moving towards balance. He will not speak about tightening our belt, but he will demagogue people who will propose such things, and that includes Paul Ryan. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm suggesting that we call upon the presidential candidates who are seeking the Oval Office and ask them, renew your efforts, declare that and ask for the support of the American people, that if you are elected to the highest elected office in this land as President of the United States, call for a mandate from the American people for this Congress to pass a balanced budget out of the House and out of the Senate and message it to the states to begin the ordeal of the ratification of a balanced budget amendment in the 38 states that are necessary in order to implement an amendment to our United States Constitution. And the balanced budget amendment must have a GDP cap. I'll stand on 18%. That's the historic take out of the GDP for the federal government, 18%, and it must require a supermajority in order to raise taxes. Mr. Speaker, this country will not survive in the long run with less. The will to balance the budget does not exist in this Congress today. It doesn't exist in the House. It surely doesn't exist in the Senate. The push from the President for deficit spending is one of the factors, but if you remove the President of the United States and put a new individual in there who is fiscally responsible, we still have the problem of the tendency to overspend and the unwillingness to tighten the belt and listen and the unwillingness to listen to the American people that insist that we balance this budget. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to see the presidential candidates call for a balanced budget amendment. I want that to be actually the second plank in their platform. The first plank needs to be the full 100% repeal of Obamacare. That's an essential component for us to get our liberty back, and it's an essential component to balance the budget. We can't afford Obamacare. It takes away our liberty. It takes away our freedom. It takes away our choices. And we're dealing now with a national debate over right to conscience. And never in the history of this country have we seen a president that had the level of audacity to believe that he could sit in the Oval Office and dictate the terms of health insurance policies to every American. And the president did so. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't Kathleen Sebelius sitting in her office with some of her trusted advisors over at HHS that decided that they were going to compel especially the Catholic, but the faith-based institutions who are providing health care services to provide also for their employees health insurance policies that 100% of them would cover birth control pills, other contraceptives, that 100% of them would cover sterilizations, tubal ligations, vasectomies in particular, that 100% of the health insurance policies would cover the morning after pill, or the Plan B pill that comes in after the morning after pill, the Ella pill that is prescribed to bring about an abortion up to 5 days, but is effective up to 22 days. That would be 4 days after the baby's heart starts beating, I might add, Mr. Speaker, to compel any religious institution, any person of faith, let alone the Catholic Church, which is the largest single institution standing for life and marriage in the United States of America. The White House understands that if they can plow through the Catholic Church on life and marriage and matters of conscience, then there's no institution left that can stand up to the President of the United States, and his radical social transformative agenda would have no serious impediment from that point forward. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, the American bishops understood what was taking place when Kathleen Sebelius made the announcement, which was actually the order of the President of the United States to compel religious institutions, in particular Catholic institutions, to fund, provide, and pay for birth control pills, sterilization, abortifacients. That was a violation of the right to privacy. It was a violation of the religious right to conscience. A right to conscience which is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, freedom of religion. But for the federal government, and I should probably not use that term quite so benignly, because this is for the President of the United States to issue such an order tells us how radical and aggressive his agenda is, maybe how out of touch he is with the faith community in America, but I compliment the American bishops for taking such a bold stand, Mr. Speaker. And the stand needed to be taken. When you think of the martyrs of history, it's not a hard stand to take here in the United States of America. You're not going to be crucified. You're not going to lose your head. You're not going to be stoned to death for taking a stand like this. You might be ridiculed, but when you stand on principle, how can that hurt? It doesn't. If you believe in the principle, it doesn't. And so, Mr. Speaker, the American Catholic bishops took this position. They said that it's a violation of right to conscience, and they wrote, "We cannot, we will not obey this unjust law." The strongest language that I have heard read from the pulpit in my years as a faithful Catholic. We cannot, we will not obey this unjust law. A bold position, a bright line, uncompromising, and I know the question was posed that the delay of 12 months in implementing the rule was to give the religious institutions an opportunity to make accommodations and adjust to the imposition of the federal government in requiring them to violate their conscience. Mr. Speaker, I'd submit that one does not violate their conscience. If it is a conscience clause that protects you, that's one thing. But it's your conscience that prohibits you from crossing the line. The lives of babies are ended by morning after pills, by the Ella pill, and it's a direct violation of the teachings of the Church and no government can compel a church to violate its conscience, nor can a government compel individuals to violate their conscience. This rule that was imposed was designed to do that, and I believe the President calculated that he could fracture the Catholic Church in doing so, and if he were successful in doing that, then there would be not an impediment in the way with the other components of the radical social agenda. But, Mr. Speaker, that didn't happen. It's not going to happen. The bishops listened to the President's, quote, accommodation, close quote, and bought a little bit of time and said, we're going to study this and deliberate and we'll give you an answer. And they did. They studied it, deliberated, and they came back with an answer in a short period of time. It was less than 48 hours, as I recall, and rejected the President's accommodation because it still violates conscience, and it violates the conscience of many faithful Americans and for Americans of all religious denominations. Particularly does it run directly against the principles of the Catholic Church. And so, Mr. Speaker, we now have a bright line drawn along the line of conscience protection, and we're having a good American debate on conscience protection, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to get that established. But I would caution this body, Mr. Speaker, if I were addressing them instead of yourself, that we should not accept the idea that we can go into Obamacare. All of this power and authority is rooted in Obamacare. Obamacare grants this authority to the executive branch. The President assumes the authority because he makes the appointments within the departments, such as Kathleen Sebelius. But to make changes in Obamacare that essentially lower the pressure, the 1099 squeal forms component, well, this House passed a bill to repeal it. And you've got other components of Obamacare that have been egregious, and efforts made to repeal a little piece here, a little piece there. The medical equipment tax would be one of those. And now we have the violation of conscience that imposes that everybody in America pay for everybody else's contraceptives and their sterilizations and their abortifacients. My conscience won't let me do that, Mr. Speaker. But yet, the President of the United States believes he has the power built in Obamacare, and every time we come to this floor and pass a piece of legislation, it takes some of the pressure off. Legislation that would amend out the most egregious aspects of Obamacare. I remember some of the language back when Obamacare was passed, and some of the leaders within this Congress, and I count you all as leaders here as I address you, Mr. Speaker, have said, we will repeal the most egregious aspects of Obamacare. Most egregious aspect? Mr. Speaker, every aspect of Obamacare is egregious. It is because it's a violation of our American liberty. And if we repeal one egregious aspect after another, after another, after another, each time we do that, we take the lid off the pressure cooker, and we lose that opportunity for the heat to come up where we can solve the whole mess. So I have argued since the beginning we need to hold the lid on, keep the pressure on, let the heat increase until such time as we are all ready to pass a repeal of Obamacare and send it to the next president. This president, we have an idea what he would do with it, but the next president will sign the repeal. And so I've worked on that relentlessly over the last couple of years and worked with each of the presidential candidates on this, and every Republican candidate has taken a pledge or an oath multiple times for a 100% full repeal of Obamacare. Almost all but one of them have pledged to rip it out by the roots and not leave, to repeal 100% of Obamacare and not leave one particle of it left behind. It's what we must do if we're going to keep faith with our founding fathers. It's what we must do if we're going to protect and preserve and refurbish the liberty that's God-given to us as Americans. It's what we must do if we hope to have an economic future in this country with an unsustainable Obamacare staring at us. It's what we must do. So if we're going to have research and development in the health care industry, and if we're going to continue to lead the world in providing health care, it's what we must do if we're going to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, which we've all taken an oath to uphold. All of these are reasons for the full 100% repeal of Obamacare, Mr. Speaker. It needs to happen, needs to happen in the first weeks of the next Congress, and the repeal needs to be set upon the podium on the west portico of the Capitol, prepared there for the next President of the United States, so when he takes the oath of office, his first act in office can be to sign the repeal of Obamacare right there at the podium, the west portico of the Capitol. I hope to have a good seat for that glorious occasion, Mr. Speaker, and I'll intend to do my share of the work to continue this argument to position us so that this Congress is prepared to pass that repeal. And I believe that we should just go through a warm-up drill here fairly soon. Now, this is St. Valentine's Day, February 14th. Sometime in the next 30 to 60 days, it would be appropriate, Mr. Speaker, for the House of Representatives to renew and refresh our vote to repeal Obamacare again. Perhaps the people over in the Senate have understood how important it is and have changed their mind, but I believe that this Congress should remind the American people that we are still 100% of the Republicans in a bipartisan way in favor of the full 100% repeal of Obamacare. That's an important message to send. Mr. Speaker, I'd also submit that the repeal of Dodd-Frank is an essential component, too. We've got to do a lot of undoing of this administration before we can get turned around to the doing that we need to do to start the reform process over again. We will have lost 2 or 3 or more years before President Obama in being locked up in a Congress that's led by Nancy Pelosi then and Harry Reid on the floor of the Senate. And we'll have lost 4 years of the Obama presidency. We've got to make some progress. We've got to make some progress, and that can't come as long as Obamacare sits in the way. It can't come as long as Dodd-Frank sits in the way. The decisions that were made by Barney Frank and Chris Dodd to presumably reform the financial world, well, the solutions came from some of the people that contributed to the problem. And I would suggest that we do this as a financial package, Mr. Speaker, and that would be in the early days of the 113th Congress to pass the repeal of Dodd-Frank, pass the repeal of the Community Reinvestment Act, and to move Fannie and Freddie even more boldly towards privatization. And some of that, I understand, is in the agreements that are being negotiated right now. But it won't be bold enough or strong enough, I'm convinced of that. And by the way, let's repeal Sarbanes-Oxley while we are at it. If we do that, running the table is what I would say. Repeal Dodd-Frank, Sarbanes-Oxley, the Community Reinvestment Act, and move Fannie and Freddie towards privatization. All of those things will lay a foundation where we can write some reasonable regulations in on our financial institutions, open this country back up to do business again, Mr. Speaker. And I think it'd be appropriate of this Congress to move the repeal of Dodd-Frank that Michelle Bachmann has introduced. She has carried that legislation with her around on the presidential campaign trail. She is the lead on repeal of Dodd-Frank, and I think it'd be a great way to welcome her back to the conference after a brilliant run for the presidency, is to bring her repeal bill forward here on the floor, the repeal Dodd-Frank. And it sends a message, Mr. Speaker. The message that it sends is the House is for repeal of Dodd-Frank. The presidential candidates are for repeal of Dodd-Frank. Send it over there to the Senate and let them see what they want to do about it. But getting that marker down helps encourage the presidential candidates. This Congress is in and will be in lockstep with the Republican nominee. Those principles that are universal among all Republican candidates at this point should be moved by the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. For example, passing official English. 87% of the people in this country support English as the official language. It sits there as a dormant issue because it seems as though the only agenda that this Congress has is jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, people earn better pay and better benefits in their jobs when they have English skills. We burn billions of dollars, and that means consume or waste. That was hyperbole, so to speak. We waste billions of dollars in multilingualism, when the strongest, most powerful unifying force known to humanity throughout all of history is having a common language. It's more powerful than a common religion, a common background, a common race or ethnicity. It's more powerful than a common sex. It is the most powerful unifying force in the world. When God looked down at the Tower of Babel, and he said, "Behold, they are one people, they speak all one language, and they're building the tower to the heavens with the arrogance that we remember." And he said, "Behold, they are one people, they speak all one language, and nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them because of having a common language to bind them together." And so God scrambled their language, and that's where the Tower of Babel came from, and they began to babble, and they couldn't understand each other, and they split up to the four winds. And that's the Old Testament story about how we ended up with so many different nations. We also know historically what has happened. People move into enclaves and live in those enclaves that communicate with each other. If they do that and don't have a language, they'll create their own. But even if they go there with a language, the language morphs into something else if it doesn't interrelate with the other communications in the region, in the neighborhood, in the world. And so we have an encouragement going on in this culture of encouraging language enclaves instead of the success of assimilation. And I think we should move the H.R. 997, the English Language Unity Act, here right away. It's an 87% issue. I know nothing more popular than that. If I've got an agenda here, Mr. Speaker, that is as popular as 87% among the American people, and I can't get a vote, meanwhile the President can offer his budget and 97 senators reject it and he gets a vote, there's something really wrong with that. There's a lot of disparity between the two. And so I think that's another thing that needs to happen. Let's move English. Let's move the repeal of Dodd-Frank. Let's move the repeal of Obamacare. Those pieces would be good messages to send to the American people. They're good pieces of policy to be established to lay on the desk of Harry Reid that can join the cordwood of the jobs creation legislation that this House has sent over to the Senate and help set the stage for the next President of the United States, who needs to come in with a strong mandate from the American people, from the United States Congress, with a clear vision that Americans support our new president to take us where we need to go as a people. But the components of the agenda of the next president need to include a balanced budget amendment, a commitment to that balanced budget amendment, and a mandate from the American people to get that balanced budget amendment passed. It's the only way that I can see we get that accomplished, Mr. Speaker, and we need to call for the presidential candidates to call for a balanced budget amendment. So I would go through these issues again. Pass a balanced budget amendment, one that has an 18% cap on spending of GDP, one that requires a supermajority to raise taxes, that has legitimate exemptions for a declared war or a case of a serious national emergency. Balanced budget amendment, repeal Obamacare, repeal Dodd-Frank and the other financial components that I said, and let's move forward with a country that's based upon freedom, upon liberty, upon free enterprise. If we do all that, Mr. Speaker, the American people will take care of the rest. We still have interest that we've got to pay and principal that's got to be paid down before we can get rid of the interest bill. This is a huge credit card that has been run up. The deficit, the debt of the countries in trouble in the EU is $4.5 trillion, and now President Obama's $1.33 trillion added on to his $4+ trillion threatened to take his term of the presidency well over $5 trillion, knocking on the door of $6 trillion in accumulated debt in his time in office. And whatever we do that's good, we still have to pay the interest and have to pay the principal on that debt. So the recovery time, the depth of which we might have otherwise fallen a little bit further, but it takes a lot longer to recover when you borrow the money to do so. That's the nature of the free enterprise system. That's the nature of capital and investment and risk. That's the nature of Keynesian economics that the President has embraced. And I am a supply-sider. And I don't believe that borrowing money, handing it to people, telling them it's their patriotic duty to go out and spend that money is how we're going to recover from this economy. We're going to recover from this downward economy by producing those goods and services that have a marketable value here and abroad. We do that, we'll sell, we'll compete, we'll rebalance our trade deficit, we'll make American industry strong again, and we will again be the powerhouse of the world. And when that happens, we are strong culturally, politically, we're strong militarily, we're strong economically, and we'll continue to be looked up at by the rest of the world. If we fail economically, if we become one huge Greece, as Chairman Ryan is concerned and as I am and many others, if we become one huge Greece, there is no one to bail us out. There's no one there. We can hold our tin cup out, but no economy will be big enough to put enough in the tin cup that we can get a meal. We would be in a situation of default. It would be a sad, sad day in America. It would take generations to build our credit back again. It would take generations to recover. In fact, the trajectory of this country would be so altered that we could never recover. The power of the world will fill, power abhors a vacuum. It fills it. And if America has an economic crisis, as I'm suggesting, looms in our future, that power, that global vacuum will be filled by our competitors. And much of that power that is projected around the world has been paid for in treasure and blood, Mr. Speaker. And we must maintain that for the future destiny of this country, and we must maintain it out of honor for those who have sacrificed so much to project freedom and liberty around the world. We are a great country. We're the unchallenged greatest nation in the world. We derive our strength from Judeo-Christianity, Western civilization, and free enterprise capitalism. We need to understand those underpinnings of American exceptionalism, those pillars of American exceptionalism. We need to celebrate them. We need to teach them. We need every child to understand the pillars of American exceptionalism and be able to recite them in the same fashion that the seven sacraments are recited in the very Catholic Church that's standing up for our constitutional rights today, along with the other faith-based organizations. It's a big picture we have going on in this country, Mr. Speaker. It's a great country that we are. It's a great country filled with great people, people with individual spirits, individual sense of self-sacrifice, willing to tighten their belt, willing to carry their share of the load. Well, what do they want out of it? An opportunity to work, prosper, raise their family, live free without an oppressive government reaching in and regulating every aspect of their very lives. They want to be able to utilize the God-given liberty that was articulated by our founding fathers and promote that kind of liberty to all humanity throughout the world, wherever they may be. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate your attention to the discussion that I've had with you this evening.